I'm introducing to you Dwaipayan Chowdhury while he's getting set up. It's my pleasure to introduce him to you. We saw this play at the Volksbühne yesterday. I'm missing the door. I need to kind of do this so everyone's awake and we can continue. New entrance. He has been awarded his PhD from the International Research Center Interweaving Performance Cultures at the Freie Universität Berlin. He studied communication, literature, and theater and performance in Berlin, Amsterdam, New Delhi, and Kolkata. His writings have been widely published, for example, in the Brecht-Jahrbuch, and he was an assistant faculty member at the Department of Theater and Performance Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Before that, he had been an active member of the group theater movement in Kolkata, and presently his research interests include readings of Brecht, emancipatory politics, aesthetic subjectivity, mise-en-scène studies, performance philosophy, and de- and anti-colonial theory. Respondent to Dwai's presentation will be Mark Silbermann. He is a professor emeritus for German literature and German film history and interdisciplinary theater studies at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He was editor of the Brecht-Jahrbuch in the early 90s, and I think he's well known to most of us for his many translations into English of texts by Bertolt Brecht and Heiner Müller. So very important work for people working with Brecht in the English-speaking world, with students and also in research. So now we are listening to Dwai's presentation on Actualizing Brecht for Kolkata stages.
Danke, Professor Klook. Ich möchte auf Deutsch sprechen, aber Entschuldigung, I don't have the capacity to do academic research of Deutsch, but I want to. That's sometimes I really, I'm enthralled by the sort of, as Snehal said, the staccato of the language, some words. But I will start. I will not introduce anything as far as the context of this presentation is concerned. I guess we can talk about it later. But I'll start. The title is Whither, and of course, thank you for inviting me, and I almost forgot that. Whither der Nullpunkt, the 0 point, Actualizing Brecht for Kolkata stages. During early exile, Bertolt Brecht wrote a couple of short fragments concerning der Nullpunkt, or the 0 point of drama and the stage. Introducing us to the fragments, Mark Silbermann writes, "The two notes on the 0 point are among the various texts about the inductive method for preparing a role, a strategy aimed at avoiding empathy and thus within the broader reaction to Stanislavski's acting method. Furthermore, the 0 point is referred to again with regard to Brecht's espousal of an inductive method for the actor to construct a role in the context of his reflections on non-Aristotelian drama." And this is, I paraphrase Professor Silbermann. We notice, now this is my sort of intervention, we notice that the 0 point presents itself as a conceptual quandary, because in the annotations, the readers are told that the 0 point could be, are told what the 0 point could be through what it is not. For example, as something non-Stanislavskian or non-Aristotelian. Herein, On one level lies the problematic of actualizing the Brechtian 0 point as a cogent practical or theoretical structure. For in answering the question, Whither, Nullpunkt, or how and where is the 0 point actualized, we might have to endure a hurdle, since we may never know directly what it is, except that it is recalcitrant to habitual concepts and categories. Instead, we assume the 0 point as that which could be rather explored and thus be deferred and renewed than as that which necessarily requires concrete actualization. And here I have a theoretical framework. I have a kind of methodological framework to it, but it's in the footnotes. We can discuss this during the question-answer session. On another level, the hurdle of conceptualizing the 0 point also embraces its unique promises. From Brecht's fragments could be inferred that the lacuna of the 0 point, its missed actualization, enables a crisis of drama, a crisis that in its post-dramatic impetus dwells on the immanent theatricality of the mise-en-scène. Brecht's cursory notes hint towards this orientation of the 0 point through suggestions that, and here I am trying to paraphrase what Professor Silberman translated in English, it is a provocation for the actors and set designers to be open-minded so as not to fit on stage things they always wanted to do. It's not a method, it is a method to make strange what have been achieved on stage through a process of constant questionings and rebuildings. And number 3, a provocation to challenge the dramatist so as to revere the actors and the audiences, etc. When Silberman explains the Brechtian 0 point as an actor-oriented inductive method in contradistinction to Stanislavski's acting method or Aristotelian drama, I argue such a claim does not simply refer to an empathy distance or an Aristotelian epic contrast. What Silberman deciphers could be read as an experiment to actualize the immanent theatricality of the mise-en-scène. At stake is a non-positionality or eccentricity of the 0 point, whose mobilities could be provisionally actualized to suit artistic practices in varied geopolitical context. Important is how the 0 point litigates any misplaced authorial authority accorded to the past cultural icons for new interpretations. But how might we think of actualizing things Brechtian without according a misplaced authorial authority to Brecht? In answer, we hark back at 2 very different readings of Brecht, forwarded by 2 of the most prominent yesteryear theatre directors from Kolkata. First, Utpal Dutt's dramatic dialogue, penned in Bengali, titled Shakespeare o Brecht, Shakespeare and Brecht in 1988. Second, Ajitesh Bandyopadhyay's onstage rendering of Brecht's Die Groschenoper in Bengali as Teen Paishar Pala in 1969. Both Dutt and Ajitesh, by attempting to actualize Brecht's theory and practice in their own ways, sought to propose unique models for a popular theatre on the Kolkata stages, models which also aspired to realize the then urgent program of a new political theatre. And yet, Dutt's and Ajitesh's reading of Brecht diverged significantly from each other. It is in these divergences one deciphers the problem and also the richness of actualizing Brecht. And now is the second section where I deal with Utpal Dutt's actualization, reading of Brecht, or in terms of this workshop, actualization of Brecht. Utpal Dutt, 1929 to 1993, was an actor, playwright, and director who worked both in theatre and films. Dutt's theatre career spanned over 4 decades, from his founding of the Little Theatre Group in Kolkata in 1947 till his death, by which time he was producing for the People's Little Theatre, another group founded in 1969 also in Kolkata by Dutt and his friends or associates. Dutt's theatrical stagings ranged from agitprop street plays to performances in urban theatre auditoriums with lavish spectacles, and also to his engagements with the traditional popular performance form of the Jatra in rural locales, primarily in the regions of West Bengal. Initially, that produced English plays. Little theatre group's first performance was Shakespeare's Richard III in Kolkata on 15th August 1947, the day India was, quote-unquote, officially declared independent. However, with a dwindling audience for English theatre in Kolkata, Little Theatre Group began producing Bengali performances by 1952. Significant was Dutt's apprenticeship to the English actor-director Geoffrey Kendall around 1953-1954, and his travels with his troupe Shakespeareana across India and Pakistan to stage Shakespeare plays. By participating in the traveling troupe, Dutt started realizing the demands of a popular theatre, which would be epitomized later on in his major works for the Jatra. Right after, Dutt's rigorous study of Marxism and his involvement with the Indian People's Theatre Association, a cultural organization formed in 1943 with the affiliation of the then Communist Party of India, proved fruitful for him to ponder over a model of political theatre. Dutt's search for a radical political theatre, or what he called a revolutionary theatre, would take him beyond IPTA, or the Indian People's Theatre Association. He would get disassociated from this organization. Post Indian People's Theatre Association and then he makes this group, Little Theatre Group, for LTG, that would come up with milestone productions of Shakespeare's Macbeth in 1954 and Othello in 1958 in Bengali, and from the late 1950s began penning original Bengali dramas by putting on stage tumultuous anti-colonial political events by casting them as episodes of world historical significance. From the early 1960s, Dutt's engagements with international exchanges, his travels around the world, his study of the theatres in the erstwhile German Democratic Republic and the Soviet Union finally culminated in the founding of the Brecht Society of India in 1964. It was also in 1964 that 3 Shakespeare plays were premiered and one was revived by Dutt's group. Just to mention here, Dutt was one of the few theatre makers who directly translated. He never performed a Brecht play, but he knew German. Although Dutt never staged Brecht, on grounds that the Brechtian aesthetic could be too cerebral for the audience of Bengali theatre and Jatra, the journal of the Brecht Society of India, called Epic Theatre, and it had a logo of Mother Courageous cart, and it was sketched by the eminent filmmaker Satyajit Ray, the eminent Bengali filmmaker. Anyway, called Epic Theatre, which was, because he never staged that on grounds that the Brechtian aesthetic could be too cerebral for the audience of Bengali theatre and Jatra, the journal of the Brecht Society of India, called Epic Theatre, which was edited by Dutt, evinces a theoretical actualization of Brecht. The journal published articles, dramas, poems concerning Brecht in particular, and Marxist and anti-colonial culture in general from across the globe. From the 1970s, for his project of a revolutionary theatre, Dutt takes up the question of dialectics of theatre actively. Of concern for Dutt was how could the contradictory aspects of historical materialism be embodied on stage, make his dramas more complex, and advocate for a radical theatre historiography. It is from these concerns that he reverts back to Brecht and Shakespeare. The dialogue Shakespeare or Brecht, Shakespeare and Brecht, was published in the Epic Theatre Journal in 1988. It begins with a group of young actors who claim to engage in a quote-unquote radical alternative theatrical experiment by performing Oedipus without words, stage shock tactics such as body and vocal contortions, plans to make quote-unquote love piles, copulate and excrete on stage, get drugged to act naturally, etc. It was their way to state that art is bourgeois, art is shit. When enters Brecht, who starts questioning the actors. Brecht's intervention here is to salvage the literarity of theatre, its verses, the gestus of dialogues, the revolutionary heritage of the classics, as Shakespeare also enters the scene. Shakespeare enters as Brecht's rightful predecessor, to whom Brecht could fall back upon as someone from whom he not only inherits the audacity to make his theatre popular through its literarization, but also as someone from whom he learns about the terrifying alienation, the precarity, the hope, and the perpetual transmutability of existence. Shakespeare also acclaims Brecht as a most accomplished playwright of the 20th century who immanently realized the revolutionary praxis of the times on stage as he did back in his. The dialogue proceeds through various topics, for instance, about their projects for a professional theatre which could rivet the audience through a whirlwind of onstage incidents. On-stage acting which suits the audience to fulfill their imagination through unsheathed verses and overemphasized gestures. The technique of dramatic and mise-en-scène compositions and how they respond to their times as well as depend on their concrete actualizations. The rootedness of their theatrical experiments in a colloquy of the disenfranchised, sometimes through the weapons of sardonic satire, excessive violence, or hyperbolic passions. Both their obsessions with crimes and criminals and the complications of good and evil, their experiments to portray wars and mass uprisings contradictorily, and not least the contradictory mutability of their famed protagonists. Overall, I read Dutt's project to think a genealogy of Shakespeare's novelty in Brecht as an exercise to delve into what he saw as the Historisierung, or the historicizing principle of the Brechtian epic, of course, drawn from Dutt's own dialectical understanding of theatre and history. My assessment hinges on a double proposition. First, follows from Dutt's take on actualizing past literary classics on stage to portray their contemporary relevance. Dutt deemed Brecht's epic as a revolutionary method for analyzing and resisting the capitalist crisis and most suited during, and this is very important, during the proletarian age. Shakespeare was Brecht's worthy predecessor, since Shakespeare was the most vociferous voice on stage against the vices of the bourgeois during its rise. In fact, he has a big essay also, which deals with the political metaphor of forest in Shakespeare and how that critiques the rising bourgeois vices. I mean, we can discuss that later. This argument has consequences, not least concerning the 0 point. In the dialogue, Shakespeare and Brecht disagree on some issues. Fundamental is Brecht's criticism against Shakespeare's sympathetic humanism that lingers despite his stormy plots, the brutality of his protagonists, and their larger-than-life rages. Such, Brecht argues, is the result of Shakespeare's still enduring belief in the great Renaissance revolution, which had dared to replace God with noble human aspirations by tearing apart feudal reactions. But that it will turn into a cobweb of profit-mongering lechery, begetting wars and genocides within a few centuries, was a fact that he could not grasp. The aesthetic aftermath of this was clear for Brecht. That Shakespeare's criminals, like an Edmund or a Macbeth, exuded empathy, that through their interior monologues, they shed light upon the mind justifying evil plots to flout moral codes, that only the human mind enforced or rescued the turmoils of human destiny, and that it aspired to account for a total worldview of the characters without an episodic criticality. On one hand, Brecht's disagreement historicizes Shakespeare's theatrical humanism, finds a 0 point in it to actualize it as per certain thesis of the epic method. In a way, that here dialectically reads what Brecht himself deemed to be the quote-unquote unvarnished representations on Shakespeare's stage. On the other hand, and this is my second proposition, the historicizing principle traces the genealogy of the anti-hero or the negative hero that Brecht actualizes from Shakespeare. That deciphers the 0 point of Brecht's quote-unquote gallery of rogues as a historical materialist reconsideration of Shakespeare's mythic wretches. specific to his age. In the dialogue, Brecht's and Shakespeare's conversations on the negative hero is punctuated by the demonstration of certain popular scenes from both the dramatists as interludes. To end this section, I will give 2 examples. First, Brecht begins by admitting how his earlier interpretation of King Lear was marred by a simplistic notion of Lear's isolation from his family and the state. Brecht accused Shakespeare of eulogizing Lear's seclusion to show his greatness as a tragic hero. To this, Shakespeare retorts that Lear's forest is not a sanctuary to indulge in greatness, but a dialectical expanse of becoming, wherein a wronged king becomes as laughable as a Falstaff in a tavern. It is now that Brecht realizes the reason for Lear's isolation, its 0 point, which is also why he cut Mother Courage off from all ties with society, the depravity of the oppressor classes. To this, the young actors stage 2 scenes back to back, starting with Lear with his beloved Cordelia's lifeless body in his arms, and then Courage with her beloved Catherine's corpse in hers. Number 2, this is a second example of the scene. There are many scenes that describes, but this is another example. Brecht discusses with the young actors how he dialectically adapts Shakespeare's anti-heroes. At this, the actors are asked to stage 2 scenes. First, the nightmare of Richard III, when he is visited by the ghosts of the feudal lords he murdered. Second, the nightmare of Arturo Wee. Just a second, I'm sorry. When he is visited by the ghosts of the feudal... Okay, I start again. At this, the actors are asked to stage 2 scenes. First, the nightmare of Richard III, when he is visited by the ghosts of the feudal lords he murdered. Second, the nightmare of Arturo Wee, when he is visited by the spectre of his close confidante, whom he killed. Brecht considers Richard's nightmare as a tragedy, which gets dialectically transformed to a comic farce in the case of Wee. History repeating itself as a farce is how he lays bare the 0 point of Shakespeare's tragedy. That Richard could still shudder and engage in a conversation with his ghosts reflected Shakespeare's sympathetic humanism, which by Wee's time had already bared the fangs of an anti-humanist struggle, so much so that the cheap gangster now orders his aides to shoot down even his ghosts. And this is the end of this section. And the second section, Marika, I will need the slides, but later. I will show. I will read first, and then I will end with some slides, some of the photographs, just to give a brief idea of the production. Ajitesh Bandyopadhyay, 1933 to 1983, was another outstanding actor, director, playwright in late 20th century Kolkata theatres. Unlike that, Ajitesh was from the villages and came to Kolkata as a college student. It was in the villages that he got exposed to the popular Jatra performances, from which he will borrow elements to perform Brecht's dramas later. Like that, although later than him, Ajitesh got involved with the Indian People's Theatre Association in the late 1950s, but withdrew from the organization quite soon. Ajitesh was concerned regarding the ideological course taken by the Indian People's Theatre Association, which to him, from initiating a political aesthetic in the decade before, had depoliticized himself by prioritizing the ends of electoral gains for the parliamentary left. Before staging and he was severely criticized for this. Before staging Teen Paishar Pala, he would reiterate this concern by ruefully claiming that there was no sustained tradition of political practice in India. And this is a very huge claim. Anyway, in 1960, Ajitesh with some friends would establish the theatre group Nandika, first as an Indian People's Theatre Association branch and soon as an independent collective, with which he worked till 1977. From then, he would keep on experimenting to find a political aesthetic for the stage which could also garner an intense popular appeal. The impetus was to find an alternative to the mainstream commercial theatres of the city by actualizing past dramatic classics for the stage, which might develop better playwriting practices in Bengali and, regarding the audience, develop and transform their expectations from the stage. For this project, Ajitesh stages some important modern dramatists from the West, along with a few Bengali classics and contemporary plays. It is then that he stages Tin Paishar Pala in 1969. His first Brecht rendition. The immense popularity of Tin Paishar Pala, running 469 shows, would lead him to stage Bhalo Manush in 1974, 5 years later, a Bengali rendition of Brecht's Der gute Mensch von Szechuan that ran 357 shows as well. Ajitesh was unsure of his initial encounters with Brecht. He writes about his difficulty of grasping the Brechtian Verfremdungseffekt and his repeated failures to do so. He claimed that this difficulty was more complicated by certain trends of theatre criticism prevalent in Kolkata then, which prescribed the ways to know Brecht. Number 1, watching certain performances at the Berliner Ensemble in the GDR. Number 2, reading Brecht in German. Number 3, to follow the imperatives by any Brecht expert. However, years later, after his Brecht performances, Ajitesh reflects on key aesthetic questions this performance posed. Number 1, the use of titles. Number 2, projections. Number 3, boards or placards. Number 4, the pauses or gaps between dialogues. Number 5, language of translating. Number 6, Brecht's affinity with or distance from Marxist communism. Besides, in translating Brecht's Verfremdungseffekt, or what he terms as alienation in English, in Bengali he lists the following, and these are the several ideas he derives from this word, from Verfremdung. Number 1, Samonnoy, which means simultaneity. Durikoron, which means endistentiation. Biyojon, deorganizing. Bijuktikoron, de-additioning or de-reasoning. Bichhinnokoron, secluding. Bishamikoron, de-equating. Niropekkhota, neutrality. Now I come to the performance and I will end it. Tin Paishar Pala premiered at the New Empire Theatre in Kolkata. Through this performance, Ajitesh attempted to establish a model of an alternative Bengali popular theatre. Its immediate success made Ajitesh take the risk of leasing the Rangona Auditorium, it's a theatre auditorium, where it ran to tremendous box office success over years. With Tin Paishar Pala, Ajitesh started realizing his long-cherished plan of making Nandikar, the theatre group, a professional repertory company. Reminiscences account for how Tin Paishar Pala opened up a new model of performance on the Kolkata stages. For example, a crucial development for the actors was to use the entire body in an agile way at specific moments through feats such as sudden leaps and jumps to strike the audience in sometimes ridiculous moments of stark vigor. Yet, many reviews lambasted it. They accused Ajitesh of depoliticizing and commodifying Brecht for box office returns. Statements like, Bertolt Brecht and Ajitesh Bandyopadhyay are not artists of an equal caliber, gained currency to assert how Ajitesh formalized, romanticized, and vulgarized Brecht's genius. To end, I cursorily sketch the mise-en-scène of Tin Paishar Pala. Ajitesh's risk in actualizing Brecht's drama activated its 0 point, exploded it. A tactic to achieve this was how Ajitesh disrupts any coherent chronology in the entries and exits of the actors. The actors were free to play with how they exhibit themselves to the audience. It discordantly reposited the stage repeatedly. The sudden entries and exits of actors at many levels renewed the time of togetherness with the audience incessantly and accelerated the pace at which the plot was carried forward and ruptured to garner a popular appeal. To overcome the complexities of Brecht's dramatic structure in Die Groschenoper, which is subdivided into acts, scenes, interludes, prologues, epilogues, Ajitesh renders it as a succession of scenes to enhance the simplicity and the pace of performance. By the way, it was from the Willett Mannheim translation. And this was from the English, not from the German. Although he does not hesitate to keep the duration of the entire performance to 3 hours with 2 intermissions by excluding certain important sections. Also, he does not hesitate to keep the duration of the entire performance to 3 hours with 2 intermissions by excluding certain important scenes in the digression opera, such as Peacham's morning hymn, the dinner sequence in the marriage scene, chopped off after the premiere, or songs like Zirober, Jenny, or Kanonen song, etc. Also worth mentioning is the collage aspect of the set. That, can we have this here? Okay, I will keep reading, and if we find a solution, but I have lost my page. I need to find it back. Yeah, I found it. So, okay. So also worth mentioning is the collage aspect of the set. That Ajitesh achieves by imparting upon it flexible and economic constructive principles attuned to the stage setup of Jatra. An elevated detachable hexagonal wooden platform with stairs is placed up center stage for the musicians to sit on top, and also for the actors to reassemble it for different scenes. Atop the platform are installed screens for projections. Ajitesh uses, this is the last scene. Okay. Can you, for example, the wooden structure was like this. For example, this is the wooden structure, an hexagonal, detachable, up center for the musicians to sit on top, and also for the actors to reassemble it for different scenes. Atop the platform are installed screens for projections. For example, you can see the screens here, for example. Here, Ajitesh uses 2 curtains to trifurcate the stage horizontally. An outer curtain that sometimes envelopes the entire stage area and before which certain interludes are performed, like the introductory sequence, and an inner half curtain that could be adjusted in height according to the requirements of the scene. For example, covering or exhibiting the musicians or bearing the captions for any scene. Did I include? Yeah, for example. So this was and the musicians were sitting on top of it, and it could be adjusted in its height, and this is the inner curtain. And it says the brothel, in Bengali, it's the brothel scene. So horizontal outer curtain that sometimes, and an inner half curtain, this is the inner half curtain, that could be adjusted in height according to the requirements of the scene, for example, covering or exhibiting the musicians or bearing the captions for the scenes. Through the double curtains, Ajitesh plays with and improvises upon the Brechtian politics of collage by catalyzing a collapse of the inner and outer realms of the stage, by juxtaposing the inner and outer stage areas, and by retaining the loose structures of the successive scenes. The mise-en-scène keeps splitting itself. These split generate intimate, or rather strange moments circulating between the stage and the auditorium. And now I end with the introductory scene. Ajitesh sets the performance in 1876 during Victorian Kolkata, and Brecht's Makhit as a lumpen colonial subject. For example, this is Makhit, this is brown, and this is, you can guess it, the Makhit's, So this is typically a 19th century kind of a lumpen, kind of a feudal kind of a society, half neo-colonial feudal society kind of a setup. And Brecht's Makhit as a lumpen colonial subject, Mohindro. The introduction of Mohindro, played by Ajitesh, could serve, and this is Ajitesh, by the way, about whom I'm talking here, could serve as an exemplar for the popularity of Teen Paishar Pala. As the performance begins, with the lights fading in, is gradually revealed to the audience on stage the figures of a disparate chorus carrying various musical instruments such as harmonium, small cymbals, flute, dhol and tablas, percussions, these are, shanai, wind instrument, behala, small violin, ghungur, anklet bells, etc., draped in costumes such as worn-out jackets with medals pinned to it, a feature of the on-stage clothing of Jatra performers. For example, you can get a bit of, this is the end scene, but this was again the Deuce ex machina scene. In fact, this is the Deus ex machina. This one is in the popular figure of the Jatra performances, you know. But this is, you can imagine, I mean, this was the width of the set. Yeah. Gungu draped in costumes such as, and further still others who will play various roles, putting on suggestive pieces of clothing atop their actual costumes. Here, Ajitesh indicates the actors to wear the costumes in the wrong way, such as intentionally displaying the falsity of the wigs, masks, or the anachronistic use of makeup, for example, wearing spectacles no longer worn then. The chorus sings in improvised meters of Torja-esque frolic. Torja, again, it's a rural music in West Bengal. The foul deeds of Mahindra. This is the introductory scene which, as the singing continues with rhythmic couplets, the refrains at the end of each stanza occasion the stage entry of various groupings of actors as they pass by the stage improvising certain activities. For example, to go back to this group again, so groupings like this entered and they were performing certain activities during the opening, during the introduction, during the prologue. Yeah. Finally, the musical prologue is brought to an abrupt end with a sudden sound of explosion behind the curtains, coinciding with the entry of Mohindra. The sound of a sudden explosion intensifies a succession of quick moments, such as the brusque stalling of singing by the chorus, who escape behind the curtains terrified, the sound of the brothel ladies laughing behind the curtain, Mohindra entering well-adorned and whistling a tune in a relaxed stroll as he crosses the stage, carrying a knife, while Josna, Jenny, played by Manju Bhattacharya, ardently attempts to woo Mohindra coming out from behind the curtain, and finally Jyotsna, unable to coax her man, resigns back behind the curtains with an, I have not written her man, in fact, just to, and finally Jyotsna, unable to coax, resigns back behind the curtains with an elongated response to calls by other ladies, to which the lights fade out. The extremes of joy and violence between which this introductory sequence oscillates to the actor's fast-paced change of attitudes juxtaposed with other elements of the mise-en-scène was an enthralling style prototypical of Teen Paishar Pala. Throughout, Ajitesh construes a multiplicity on stage in terms of exhibiting simultaneously parallel activities which intersect on stage. It was his way of interpreting the Brechtian suggestion to the play that theater theatricalizes it all. That the theatrical apparatus not only expresses aspects of life that the spectators want to see, but also do produce multiple interfering effects at the same time, the strangeness of which cannot be resolved. Ajitesh precisely highlights the 0 point of Brecht's drama through a staging of this strange multiplicity that the audience could not resolve. And to conclude very quickly, thus, if we ask how was Brecht actualized on Kolkata stages, we have to emphasize the 0 point of things Brechtian. Thus, and Ajitesh's reading of Brecht diverged to such an extent that we wonder whether they were talking about the same theatre maker. Indeed, they were not dealing with sameness, but a difference that emerges from beginning from the scratch, the 0 point. When Dott talks about Brecht and the classics in terms of actors and the audience challenging the authority of the dramatist through a co-authorship, or when Ajitesh states that we may wait for another Brecht by limiting the Brechtian norms of Brecht, we are hinted at a 0 point of actualizing Brecht, its counterpoints, its counter-actualizations. Of relevance here is a freedom, because neither Dutt nor Ajitesh actualizes things Brechtian without operating on them first as agents of counter-actualizations. Thank you so much for listening to me. I don't know how it sounds.
Like Misha, I may know something about Brecht, but I don't know anything about Brecht in India, especially the rich and varied traditions of theater that we've heard about today now. While I know of Utpal Dutt and his reputation for renewing modern Indian theater, I had never encountered Ajitesh. So I'm hoping that some of you here will have more relevant comments to make, and I encourage you to contribute your insights. So for those of you who have read the paper, first of all, let's see if you have some comments or questions. Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation, Dwaipayan. This probably is like a very stupid question, but I first want to start with, can you explain exactly what do you mean by 0 point? I'm so sorry about that.
It has a personal research trajectory as well, because specifically coming from theater and performance studies, I'm not from my master's I did in literary studies. There was this whole point of considering, and this was also what I did in my PhD dissertation, embodiment. And if you know the tradition I'm coming from, it's like a phenomenological tradition, specifically, from Fischer-Lichte, Malus-Ponty, this kind of, and then debate with Sartre. But that's a different question. But the point was about, not one of the foundation of performance studies has been through a sort of a rebellious critique against literature studies and the fundamental attribute to textuality as a critique of textuality and a body. How can it be? So in that sense, I slowly, after my dissertation project, I started struggling. I was thinking that whether embodiment is also can embodiment be a proper critique of textuality as also, and that suddenly took me to this whole notion of performance philosophy, in which performance philosophy, in which performance as an epistemological critique to philosophy proper, in a sense. Like when I'm talking about, let's say, performance philosophy, I'm not talking about, starting with the Socrates, and then Plato, and this kind of history of what traditional philosophical disciplines teach. It's about how art can generate its own knowledge. So this was my basic premise and my interest in performance philosophy. And 0 point, at that point in time, when I was also concluding my dissertation, these things kept on haunting me. And then 0 point is something, and this is the basis. This is to give you some context of the 0 point. So the performance philosophy, critique of text. So it's a void. It's like a dot, a dot which cannot be always contextualized or located. And this is the last sentence of my first paragraph here, can be deferred and renewed. 0 point as that, which does not necessarily requires concrete actualizations. Because one of the problems because if we think this is Brecht, okay, Brecht is revolutionary, Brecht is pro-people, I still think, and this is a very polemical comment, by the way, I still think that is falling into the trap of a necessitarian ideology, that we have to use Brecht to win votes for the left. We have to use Brecht to show, of course, there are stances which, where this kind of confrontation is needed. But then the 0 point is something, okay, I am not against using Brecht to win vote for the left. It's absolutely, I want that. But that could not be the only purpose. There could be other purposes also. Because if you reduce the entire Brechtian project to this, then it becomes problematic for me. And 0 point is a way to rescue this multiplicity. Because then, for example, what happens to Ajitesh? There have been, when I was reviewing writing about the reviews to his performance, to this performance, he was lambasted. That what is he doing? He completely doesn't understand. He is not understanding Brecht, and he is vulgarizing Brecht. He's not paying significance to the main focus in Brecht. That is the political context. He has formalized Brecht. Now, once you have do this, and this was Ajitesh's defense as well, that whatever becomes popular becomes sort of because this production became popular. So therefore, he pointed out whatever becomes popular becomes sort of politically regressive for certain critics. So in a way, he was trying. He was also. I am not supporting completely here Ajitesh also, because he also resorted to certain trickery, of course, for popularizing. But the 0 point is something non-conceptual, and this is another. I mean, like for example, Verfremdung. I mean, and okay, this is Verfremdung. You have to act like this. You have to act like this. You have to act like this. You have to do this gestures. You have to create this relation between objects. But then again, if you come up with a different interpretation, then it's challenging. It's constantly renewing knowledge. 0 point is the audacity to do that. That because Verfremdung has a historical context, it has a historical lineage, the new reader or the new creator will be bogged down by that. It's against that. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, I have like other 2-3 questions. First is you, with Ajitesh's photos that you're showing, and you described it really well, what he was trying to do with this particular play. Is it an adaptation?
Yeah, it was.
And did you happen to see the video recordings?
There was no video recording.
So...
oral history.
Oral history, okay. I think you mentioned something about his comment on politics, which you said was a very...
There's no sustained tradition of political theatre in India.
Okay, sorry.
There was no sustained tradition of political theatre in India.
Yes. With that, I just wanted to add to it that when I was talking to another theatre director in Hindi theatre, he also commented something around that when it comes to theatre, like theatre actors, when you're working with them, it's very hard to talk about the politics with them, and you have to train them, and that politics is not really there. So I was very interested in knowing more about that part.
In fact, I added one quote by Ajitesh, which I rather deleted, in which he started talking about that we, for a political theatre to emerge, I think we have to stop first to profit from the business of politics. And this he goes back to this whole Mao's 100-flower thesis also, in which he said that I'm trying to paraphrase him, and he's, for example, he's contextualizing in the context of Bengali playwriting, but I think it could be equally valid globally also, not universally, globally also, in terms of, or internationally also. He says that if we pick up the dramaturgical or the playwriting practices of any culture in any language for the last 10 and 20 years, and we see that only plays dealing with politics are written, how will that look? It will look like a garden with the same flowers. I mean, brilliant in their discipline, but quite impotent in its multiplicity. So that is why, and that is why saying that, I mean, political theatre is a term, of course, from Piscator and is a term, but I mean is a term. I mean, there have been psychological plays. There have been plays dealing with problems of individual, plays dealing with complete, gender, all issues. But to term any label, any theatre as a political theatre, I think now, specifically when, theatricality is facing a crisis and there has been a turn to performance arts, performativity, specifically from the 90s onwards. I think political theatre is itself, yeah. I
really would like to hear your response, because there are the students who are performing.
And they have to...
They're waiting, they have a rehearsal starting at...
Yeah, we run.
Okay, let me make it short.
We need the time. I really want to give some time for your response.
Okay. I'll focus on a few things that struck me when reading Dwaipayan's essay about how one might actualize Brecht in a completely different cultural context than Brecht's own. And let me begin with the Nullpunkt, the 0 point. I'm thinking of the epigram to Brecht's book-length essay called The Threepenny Lawsuit. Die Widersprüche sind unsere Hoffnung. Contradictions are our hope. The two notes that Dwaipayan mentions at the beginning of his essay comprise not even a dozen lines of prose. He wrote the two notes late in 1936-37, and neither one was published during his lifetime. In fact, they appeared for the first time in 1963 in the Surkamp edition of Brecht's works in the volumes called Schriften zum Theater. The two notes belong to a series of mostly unpublished notes authored by Brecht after his bitter experience with the production of his play The Mother, Die Mutter, in 1935 in New York City by the left-wing theater union. Brecht was shocked at how this well-meaning group was butchering his play, and he, together with his composer Hans Eisler, who were both in New York City, didn't hesitate to intervene until both of them were thrown out of the rehearsals by the director and the producer and banned from the opening night performance. But the sojourn in New York City was a decisive experience for Brecht. He realized that from his European vantage point, that he had misunderstood the importance of Stanislavski. He saw that Stanislavski's approach played an important role in America as an alternative to commercial theater. And he recognized not only Stanislavski's advantage with his systematized rehearsal and performance techniques, but also Brecht understood the rationale that Stanislavski offered to a left-wing theater for exploiting strong emotions about class struggle. During this time in New York City, Brecht also met Lee Strasberg, who led the group theater with its ultra-nationalistic style of acting and who developed the school of method acting steeped in Stanislavskian techniques of affective memory and emotional recall that would become the dominant approach of American acting in the 1950s. I must mention that Lee Strasberg was interested in Brecht's learning play Die Maßnahme, The Measures Taken, and they actually began rehearsals of it in January 1936 together with Brecht that lasted for about 2 weeks, convincing Brecht that it would be possible to make revolutionary pedagogical theater in the United States of America. The two notes on the 0 point are among the various texts about the inductive method for preparing a role, a strategy aimed at avoiding empathy, as you've pointed out, and thus within Brecht's broader reaction to Stanislavski's acting method. At the same time, in numerous other notes, Brecht describes how the deductive method strives for a naturalistic representation and psychological realism in contrast to his own non-mimetic realism. I would argue that the crucial difference between Brecht and Stanislavski is not to be found in their theories of actor training, but in the end product. That is, in the intended audience experience of the stage performance.
Exactly.
While Stanislavski positioned the audience as voyeurs and asked them to suspend their disbelief in order to recognize the staged performance as true reality, Brecht wanted the audience to become aware of being in the theater, and he wanted to change their expectations of how to watch and what to expect from a theater performance. And this is exactly what you lay out for us in the discussion of Utpal Dutt, who adapted Brechtian ideas not by staging Brecht's plays, but both as an editor of the journal Epic Theater for the Brecht Society of India and in his own theater practice of staging revolutionary plays he wrote in Bengali. And similarly, Ajitesh, who took a different path to Brecht, successfully did stage several Brecht plays, but he realized that a recipe of copying Brecht was not the right answer. And thank you, by the way, for summarizing Ozzy Tesch's reflections on how he learned to actualize Brecht's model for what he needed in order to bring Brechtian theater to Kolkata. Especially his various attempts at translating the key concept of Verfremdung. I liked that.
Thank you, sir.
This brings me to another point, very briefly, the status of Brecht as a teacher of how to make political theater or how to make theater political.
Exactly.
How does he fit in when political theater is on the agenda? That is an artistic practice that intervenes in a crisis situation. You may be aware that two of the most performed Brecht plays currently are the 1939 anti-war Mother Courage and Her Children, set in the 16th century, and the 1941 Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, a satirical allegory set among the Chicago gangsters about the rise of Hitler. Two plays that seem especially topical in our own time of geopolitical crises. And I think we may be hearing more about that this afternoon at 4 p.m. from the panel, Good Times for Brecht. So maybe just two very quick questions for you. Maybe not. I don't think we have time.
We can talk in the break.
We can talk in the break.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much.